Hi, I'm Alison Calder, a writer for the Prairie Interlace exhibition catalog, and I'm here with Aganetha Dyck, one of the artists in that exhibition. Now, Aganetha, in the 1970s, you were in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan,
Yes.
and at that time you started working on Close Knit, one of the works which we have in the Prairie Interlace exhibition. And I'm
Yes.
wondering if you could start us off by talking about the context there, who you were working with, and how you came to working with felted wool, and sort of what kind of influences were there, and how it was that you turned to this what some people might consider an odd medium, I suppose, for your work.
Okay. It was in 1975 that I began sharing a studio with Professor George Glenn in Prince Albert. And what I was doing at the time was weaving under the direction of Margaret Van Walsum, who was a Saskatchewan weaver. But the weaving process was really too slow for me. And what happened was, whenever we had a sheep's fleece for the weaving, we had to wash it, card it, spin it, all those techniques. But one day, the fleece that I was hoping to wash got stuck in the agitator of the washing machine, because the person that was helping me wash it thought she was putting her clothes in the washer, and instead she threw my beautiful wool in there. And so it got all clumped up around the agitator. And I just loved the result. I had to cut it out with a knife. And what happened after that was, because I really liked this shape that came from the wool fleece, I'll backtrack a little bit. When I entered the studio with George Glenn, I told him that I had never had a studio and I didn't know what to do in the studio. And he said, asked me, what do you do at home? What do you really like doing in household chores? Because I was a mom and a homemaker. And I said, I like doing laundry. And so he said, so you'll do laundry at the studio. And I thought this was a little bizarre. But one thing led to another. George was very generous with his time. And I decided, well, if I'm going to do laundry, how's that going to work as an art process? But at the same time, I was walking around Prince Albert streets trying to figure this out. And I went past the Sally Ann, and they were throwing away all their woolens that weren't selling. And I thought, oh, I could shrink those. And because they would become tight and tiny, and maybe that would work. So I took all the clothes that the Sally Ann was throwing out, discarding, and took them to the studio. They were garbage bags full. And I got a washing machine, one of the old agitators, and I started shrinking the wool, the garments. And as they came out of the washing machine, they were much smaller than I had ever anticipated, because they were tiny, like you could cover your toaster with a sweater, shrunken sweater. And one thing led to another, and I knew I was sculpting. And I was very, very excited, but also a little, I don't know, not ashamed, but a little bit scary what George and everybody would say. But George was very encouraging, and all the clothes were dripping all over my studio space into the drain. And then Carol Phillips came from MacKenzie Art Gallery. And she said to me, well, if you're doing this now as an art practice, what are you going to be doing in 5 years from now? And that was the best question or statement she could have ever said to me, because she gave me permission that what I was doing, which was laundry, was important, and that I was an artist. And I took every course there was at the Prince Albert Art Center. I studied at the community college with George, life drawing, and art criticism. I read books I had never heard of. George had a huge library. So I became immersed in the art world in Prince Albert and never looked back. It was absolutely incredible. And I was also crocheting. So I had this bundle of, looked like sacking. I don't know what it was called. And so I crocheted one work that was called Rope Dance, and it'll be in the show. But what happened, the other work that's in the exhibition is called Close Knit, and it's 65 shrunken off-white and white sweaters. And every time I shrunk those colors, I would put them together in the studio on the floor after they were dried. And it just became, it took years and years of collecting, but Close Knit is, it was something that just happened as I went along. I also had a black Close Knit, which is in the Winnipeg Art Gallery, but it doesn't have as many sweaters as the Close Knit white has. So have you got a question for me, Lindsay?
I do have a question for you. So I'm thinking when you're talking, it sounds like you were really in the right time and place with the right people around you. It sounds so productive. And I'm struck sort of by the elements of chance almost in your formation at this time, I suppose, happening on this giant, I don't know, cornucopia of sweaters outside the Salian, for example.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question I have for you is about the sweaters themselves a little bit. And they're such human things, they really hold the human form, and they really have a kind of an animation to them, or a kind of personality. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because obviously, if the Salian pile had been old blankets, for example, you would have ended up with something a little bit different. So can you talk about the, I guess, personality of Close Knit, or maybe just the effect that using sweaters has on the piece?
Well, at the same time that I was shrinking the sweaters and putting them together, my grandmother had been telling me stories of their fleeing from a war in Europe many years ago. And she was saying that they had to put on all the clothes they could because they had to walk from their home and where they were fleeing, right? And Grandma was telling me how the wool was keeping them warm. It was, and how everybody that was in the fleeing the army, the enemies, everybody was wearing warm and was trying to stay close together. So it's part of that close knit. It was like a community that was marching, and it's part of what Close Knit is all about. But the clothes definitely look as if, sometimes I would dream about what the person looked like that wore a certain sweater. But I have to tell you a little story, because one day there was a knock on the studio door, and George said, "It's for you, Aganetha." So I went, and there was a lady, I don't know, she must have been about 75, 80 years old. And she was carrying a grocery bag full of stuff. And she said to me, are you the artist that shrinks clothes? And I said, yes. And she said, my son died. He was in his 50s, and he was a lumberjack. And I knit his his long johns and his sweaters and all sorts of clothing. I wonder, would you shrink them for me? And I was totally taken aback and didn't know who the woman was. And I said, yes, I would do that. And she said, I don't want them back. I just like you to display them if they become part of your art practice. And so I did, of course. But it was a very heartfelt moment to think this lady had made these beautiful clothes. And I shrank them, and the long johns just became these tiny little baby outfits. And then I had pictures of what her son looked like. It made me really understand that, yes, laundry was art making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the emotional resonance of that is very moving. Just hearing you talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
So you have two close knit series. One of them is the one that's in the exhibition, and that's the one that's the off whites and the creams and the whites. And then you have a darker one. Is there a difference between those two for you in terms of, I guess, the effect the color has, or what the color is doing in those pieces?
I think the black just happened. There are only about 10 or 12 sweaters, and they're not as important to me as the white ones, because the white ones, they hold each other up. When they're installed, they almost look human, I think. Like they have some sort of connection to humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So, which the black ones really never did for me. I would say that it's an okay piece of art, but it's not, doesn't have the meaning that the white ones do, or the off-white.
Right. So I'm thinking that in the kind of shrinkage that you were doing of the garments really requires a kind of a trust in the process, a kind of a willingness to give up a little bit of control, maybe. I've only ever accidentally felted and shrunk things, and the result is not always what I would have expected it would be. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what seems to be, I guess, like a willingness that you have to give up control, or maybe like to share control with something else, right? Whether that's like a collaborator as a person, or whether that's the washing machine, I guess, like whirring away as the wool pulls into itself.
Well, after you mentioned, okay, I'm going to backtrack. You mentioned about losing control. The whole process of shrinking all these clothings was definitely losing control. However, I learned so much about, like I would shrink some of them for every morning. I would come to the studio, throw in the garments I had shrunk the day before and shrink them again. And they became smaller and smaller and smaller. And I thought of it, not that I knew very much about sculpting at that point, because I had never had any art lessons until I got to PA. But I could see that they were sculptures. And I thought, well, what's the difference how you sculpt? It's what, how it turns out. Like, is it say something, or, well, I don't know. I just kept seeing the people that, especially after this lady that came to the door with her bag of her son's clothing, I saw more and more of humanity in everything, all the clothes that the washing machine shrunk for me. It was a collaboration, and I've been collaborating in my work since the shrunken clothes. So it's I'm very interested in collaborating, and whether it's the machine that's collaborating with me, or another person, or materials, it's I'm not doing it by myself. I have to stop and look and think and take what the other person or machine is doing and letting some of it just happen. So there's a lot of chance in my work, but I still have to make a decision whether the chance is worth continuing or, yeah.
Right. Well, I'm so sorry that we can't continue this conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with me, Aganetha. And I'd like to invite our viewers to check out the rest of the videos for the Prairie Interlace exhibition.
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks.